this was actually their effort to answer the reformers, but it didn't seem to do a whole lot of good. We were dealing with the 7 sacraments, and we had covered most all of them. They refer to a sacrament as a blessing or grace, and you receive, through these sacraments, you receive blessings and the grace of God and so forth. The word I was trying to think of last week, Philip used in the sermon. It reminded me of it. The word ordinance. That's what we call the Lord's Supper and baptism. And they were expressions of our faith, which of course is, baptism is not really, baptism is in a way, but it's not for Christians. And so they've got the Christian on the wrong side of baptism in their ordinance. But anyway, and they only recognize 2, and that most religious groups refer to their ordinances.
I just wonder, is there a reason that they came up with the number 7 for their sacraments?
I don't know. At the end of this, I made mention that number varied through the years. It had from 5 to 12. And 7, of course, is used as a complete number in the Bible. I don't know if there's any significance to that, or do you know, Philip, anything about that? I really just don't know the answer to that. But anyway, they zeroed in on these 7, and they've grouped them, what they call the sacraments of initiation, which dealt with baptism. Of course, this is infant baptism. And then the confirmation, when you reach a certain age, then you yourself make a conscious decision to serve God. And then the Eutychus, which is what they refer to the Lord's Supper from the Greek giving thanks. But there again, they kind of included the entire Mass sometimes in that expression. And then they had the matrimony and holy orders. And I think we were finishing up matrimony when we looked at it as a sacrament, and we made mention that this is a sacrament from which you receive the grace of God, which they deny their clergy, so to speak, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, we had finished that screen and moving on to what they call the holy orders. Basically, this is how they get their leaders, their bishops, their priests, their deacons, and others, how they're ordained to receive power and grace to perform their sacred duties. It says there are 2 notable ways in which the sacrament of holy orders differs with the other sacraments. One is the fact that holy orders can be administered only by a bishop. Only a bishop has the power to ordain priests. An ordinary priest cannot pass his power on to another. The second way in which holy orders differs from the other sacraments is that holy orders is not received all at once. So it's kind of interesting how they handle this. These special ceremonies, those being ordained, receive a special anointing, and it says it transfers to them an essence of such an exalted spiritual nature that such can never be forfeited. Philip mentioned that not long ago in one of our lessons or sermon, how that no matter what they do, no matter how terrible the sin is, they've received that laying on of the bishop's hands, I guess, and no matter what they do, they don't lose that blessing, or whatever they want to call it. It says, no personal sin can ever make the ordained person unfit to function in this capacity. And then they go on to say this mysticism has no parallel in the literature of the New Testament. I guess we'd agree with that. The closest thing you could come to it would be the laying on of the apostles' hands for the miraculous powers. The hierarchy system of the Roman Church was patterned after the governmental structure of pagan Rome. And this, of course, is what we see, the rise to power and the papal authority.
You know, I was reading the Campbell-Purcell debate. I just got a copy of that, a reprint. That was the debate held in the, I think, 1820s between Bishop Purcell of Cincinnati. He was a real live wire fire breather who had gone on challenging the Protestants. A lot of Protestants were cowed down, and Brother Alexander Campbell took up the challenge and debated it. And I just gotten into it, and the interesting thing in the first speech, Brother Campbell was talking about Matthew 20. Well, what he's talking about is the hierarchy of the church and how it's so obviously different from the simple New Testament order, where all are brethren, even though you have a division of labor, you have the elders and deacons and so on. But he points out, he said, Jesus made clear that you're not to have the type of hierarchy they have. He said in Matthew 20:25, he said, you know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority over them or upon them, but it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And then he also quoted 1 Peter 5, where Peter said, don't be lording over God's heritage, but being disciples to the flock. And Brother Campbell made a good point that all this developed, which came out of the Roman Empire, and that ecclesiastical institution is a million miles away from this. But Purcell was slick, and he got up and he denied the obvious. He said, every social group has to have some sort of organization. You can't have a group where everybody's in charge. And he said, and the Bible talks about some are apostles, some prophets, some evangelists and teachers. And he said, since that's the case, we have authority right there to have a hierarchy in the church. That's a huge leap from what the New Testament says is the proper order to what they've developed. And he said, and we don't lord it over our people. He said, the Pope prays like anybody else. He gets down on his knees and prays to the statue of Peter and stuff, just whatever. I mean, what gets me is the disingenuous nature of their arguments, because they realize that their conscience won't let them come right out and say, yeah, we're a power-oriented group, and if you disagree, we'll stomp you. That's really what it involves. But they want to lie about it and say, oh, we're pious and holy and humble like everybody else. But it's obvious that they fall right into what Jesus condemned in Matthew 20 about the Gentiles lording. That's the Roman Empire is talking. They lorded over their subjects. It's not supposed to be that way among others.
Yeah, even in the church where you have elders, they're not Lord and Master, you might say. They certainly watch for our souls, and they have God-given authority to function as elders, which of course is the same as the bishop. It's interesting how they try to make a distinction between the bishops, elders, and the pastors, while that word is actually used to describe the same office, you might say, or the same person.
Go back to that one right before. I was going to say something. No personal sin can ever make the ordained person unfit. Does that mean they never can quit? Because this young guy on TV that was on Fox a lot commentating, he's decided he don't want to be a priest. He wants to get married. So what? Where does he stand? And I liked him. He's a nice guy.
I don't know the answer to that
He's
question.
young. But will they let him quit being a priest?
I don't know, but what gets me is how this is a recipe for mischief beyond mischief when it comes to pedophiles in the church and being protected and hidden by the hierarchy. because even though they're outright pedophiles, they're child molesters, they protect them and they cover for them because they think they have this essence they've received from the bishop to pass on. They're still useful. Useful idiots, I guess you could say, or useful perverts.
I don't see how they can do that.
Well, obviously that's contrary to the New Testament idea.
And the thing is, no matter what they do, it seems that they still can serve in that capacity.
Well, they have to be. Part of the,
But I don't know. I don't know how they look at those that leave their church and go into other areas of Christianity. Now, I know some converted Catholics to the church. I don't know if they're still on their roll somewhere and if they're still counted or if they're excommunicated. I don't know what they do. I guess in the case of what you're talking about, he'll be excommunicated.
Well, maybe if they commit this sin, maybe they really were never ordained to begin with. You know, maybe they just never. Maybe it never took. You know.
Well, they don't argue that. They argue they were ordained if the bishop laid hands.
I'm just
They're not
playing.
Calvinists,
I'm just riffing on Calvinism. You know.
Yeah, right.
You're never really saved. You know, if you leave the church.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know those answers.
You know, there was a debate in Pennsylvania, and some of our brethren debating the Catholics. And in that, they asked, is salvation only in the Catholic Church? And the Catholics explained, salvation comes only by means of the Catholic Church, but you don't necessarily have to be in the Catholic Church. But if you're in a Protestant church, and you're doing the best you can be saved through the merits of the Catholic Church as it kind of spills over into the Protestant church. And even my Jewish friend, one of them said here, the Jewish rabbi can be saved on the merits of the Catholic Church. And Brother Jerry Moffitt got up and said, I'm sorry. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. And if our synagogue friend here does not acknowledge that, he can't be saved. And he created a ruckus about it, an obscene. And
That was the rabbi that walked out of the debate.
That's the problem with those kind of statements, Leroy. Hey, that's the problem, I think, with making those kind of, absolutist sort of statements. You're absolutely, once saved, always saved. You've been ordained, and so therefore there's nothing you can do that will make you unfit for service. The absolutism that these heresies teach is antithetical to biblical teaching, New Testament Christianity, because the New Testament clearly teaches us that we have to continually, and you go back to my pet verse this year lately, but 1 John 1 verse 5, I think it is, or no, 7. If we walk in the light, as he is in the light. It's a constant. It's kind of a feedback loop.
Yeah.
In my mind, we have to constantly course correct as a Christian, and if you don't, then there are consequences to that. But apparently, with these various, denominationalism and the Catholic heresy, there are these absolute ideas, but that's just not the case.
Yeah, and that 1 John 1:7, as you pointed out, is a continual walk. It's the verb tense there is a continuous, present continuous. And we've talked about this on Wednesday night, as long as you are in the light. But but to say you can't get out of the light is going a little further than what the Bible allows there.
if I understand what these quotes say, if I get the gist of it, they're trying to reassure Catholic members that even if your priest is a rogue, it doesn't matter. Any of the things he did to you, it's an automatic thing. That's works righteousness with guilt. It's automatically because he did it and performed the proper ceremonies according to the rule book. It still took. And it doesn't matter about his personal godliness or not.
But that extends to the parishioners as well, because it doesn't matter what you did. Just say the rosary, count your beads. It's the works, and it's the going through the rituals, and it's the physical manifestations.
That's what Protestants rejected rightly. They balked at that, but then they went to the other extreme. And they misunderstand when they think that the New Testament teaching about baptism is works righteousness of that kind. It's 1,000 miles away from it. It's an extreme manifestation of faith,
Right.
personal faith.
Well, we mentioned here that over the many centuries of digressive development, the Roman Church has had a fluctuating recognition as to what constitutes a genuine sacrament. The number of sacraments have varied from 5 to 12. Now, I don't know what 2 would have been left out from the 7, and I don't know what 5 is added. I didn't do any research on that. But this says until 1549, the numbers, it was in that Council of Trent, 1549, that these 7 became fixed as an article of faith. And anyway, that brings us to lesson 64, and we're still in the Counter-Reformation. I just kind of wanted to finish those 2 screens on the 7 sacraments before we get back to the council. This is where we were. The 7 sacraments still exist. And then the next point had to do with the transubstantiation, which we discussed in their Eucharist sacrament. There again, affirming the presence of God in the bread and the wine, the presence of Christ, the bread and the wine. It's real and substantial. And of course, this was a great debate during the Reformation, because nobody agreed with that, but then several came close, And it's, in some cases, it's hard to actually tell the difference in a way. Martin Luther and the Greek church believed in a real presence, that it wasn't actually blood and that wasn't actually flesh, but Christ was really there. So it's kind of hard to explain the difference. I read one article where it said, Luther said it's like you put a poker in the fire and it becomes red hot. And the element has changed, you might say, but they're still the elements they were. But then there's the real presence, so I don't know. We talked about that. All right, then another thing that came out of this Council of Trent was that the canon, the books that the Bible considered God-given, is determined. I guess this is an answer to some of the questions some had, like Luther about the book of James and some more. But the interesting thing is, the Old Testament canon that they presented at the Council of Trent has 45 books in it instead of 39. And they list these 7 as just same as other books with the same authority. And that's how they look at it. Now, Luther had those, but he referred to them as the Apocryphy. And they referred to them as deuterocanonical books, and that they're on par, they said, with the other books of the canon. And but the others that included these books in their Apocryphy include them as extra books and hidden books and books that didn't really have the same authority as the other books. But the Catholics use those books, and that's where some of their strange doctrine comes from. It's from those 7 books.
We have to be reminded that the Jews of Palestine did not include those books as part of the Scripture, but only the books we have in our Bibles.
Right. The Apocryphy, it's always been a question in the minds of some. That's these books. Now, Sometimes there are more books, sometimes there are less books, but these 7 are the ones they included in the canon in 1545. But the New Testament writers and speakers never referred to these books, never quoted from them, never in any way used them to establish anything they're teaching. That's one of the, I guess that's one of the criterion for something to be authentic. Philip did a great lesson on that here a few months ago on how the canon was formulated. One of the best I ever heard, really. And of course, they have to make these books legitimate to make their doctrines sound, you know.
You happen to remember what some of their peculiar doctrines are they get out? I know purgatory is one, but
Yeah, let's see.
you got it listed?
One is the praying for the deceased in Maccabees, Second Maccabees. And that's in direct opposition to what the New Testament teaches concerning the praying for the dead. And that, of course, is associated with purgatory, as he mentioned. It says there's an episode where God assists Judith in a lie in one of these books. And the writer of this historical section just said there's no claim in any of these apocryphal books as to divine inspiration. In other words, when you read many of the Old Testament books, the word of the Lord came unto me. The word of the Lord came unto me is mentioned. That's not true in these cases. And they also were Johnny Latecomers. They weren't in the early ones.
I was wondering about the Apocrypha also contains an episode about God assisting Judith in a lie. Are they trying to support their doctrine of mental reservation?
Probably.
The idea that you can tell a lie as long as you have good
Yeah.
motive. That was one of the things that concerned Protestant leaders like B.E. Howard, who confronted at the time candidate John F. Kennedy running for president, I think about 1960. He says, Catholic, do you believe in the doctrine of mental reservation? Well, of course, he said he didn't, and you couldn't trust him when he said he didn't, because he obviously did, because he was lying about it.
Yeah, that's probably where they get that. That's why they have to use these books. They support that. And I don't know which came first. I don't know whether they found these things and said, well, let's include those because we can teach that if we do that, or what. And I've never read the book. I've never read any of these apocryphal books.
We've got a Bible that's got them in it, an old Bible.
Well, in fact, there is one of the King James
Yeah.
versions that had it in it, but other than the Catholics, everybody else does stick it in the middle between the testaments, and they don't list it, with the other books.
The book of First Maccabees is very helpful as an historical document, not as an inspired authoritative document, but historically it gives us a real good glimpse of the time period in the 2nd century BC, and its history is pretty accurate. It's been verified.
Right.
So it's a helpful document, but not as doctrine, established doctrine. Right?
Yeah, there's
I was just reading I just was reading kind of a summation. This is a Catholic scholar who is answering the charge of the lying. He says, in addition to the charge of historical error, opponents of the Deuterocanonicals also charge the character Judith with the moral fault that she lied to the general Holofernes in order to kill him. This is also easy to solve, since it is no different than the other instances in Scripture in which a woman lies in order to save lives. Examples include when the Hebrew midwives lie to Pharaoh to save the baby boys, when Rahab lies to save the Hebrew spies, etc. So that's the response. I guess
Well,
it must be.
I haven't read the context. I don't know the episode in Judas, so I can't speak to the details. But the biblical accounts, that's controversial. You have people like Norman Geisel wrote a book on ethics, in which he argued basically for a kind of relativistic ethic. Some things are more important than others, and saving life is more important than telling the truth. You can lie to save a life. But I don't know that God necessarily commended the midwives for the tactic. It was the motive of saving the children. But the tactic was something they came up with, and I don't know that they were necessarily commended for that, but the motive of saving the children.
Well, there are a lot of things that are outlined in the Bible that aren't necessarily said to be good or bad. I mean, that they're just historical mentions. So
I don't know this episode. I mean, I don't have.
Well, we have to admit that there, in historical situations, there are some descriptive things that are not prescriptive. You know, we understand that.
It's just like Sarah made Hagar leave. Sarah made Hagar leave. Abraham made her leave.
Yeah, and of course Abraham lied about Sarah being the sister, but I don't think God condoned these lies. Indulgences were kept, but they were not to be sold. This is probably about the only positive thing that came out of the Council of Trent. There were some rules concerning the ecclesiastical discipline, but there again, we know from even recent things that they still protect their leaders. The Inquisition, that's another thing. This goes back a couple of hundred years prior to the Council of Trent, the 12th century. Now, we studied a little bit of this. We didn't go into a lot of detail, but in what we call the morning star of the Reformation, the Waldensians and some of the other early reformers lost their lives during this Inquisition that they set up in order to, and they would come into an area and find what they called heresies, heretics, even using dubious methods, trickery and whatever. Might even pretend to be a heretic themselves to get you to agree with them, and then you could lose your life. 32,000, they said, lost their lives. We talked about the Caterists and the Waldensians back during that period of time, and that's when this Inquisition started. So they decided to keep it, the Council of Trent, and there were other Inquisitions from that period of time. There's also a group, I didn't go into it on this, called the Jesuitites or something like that. Are you familiar with them?
The Jesuits.
Jesuits or something.
Jesuits is an order of Jesuits.
There's some order they formed that was supposed to police, I guess. I didn't go in a lot of detail over that, but it was interesting to read about Galileo and his trial. He was tried for believing the sun was the center of the universe, I believe was what his theory was. And there was an apology from the Catholic Church to him several hundred years later, as people learned more, I guess.
I heard a debate in which I think it was our brother David Hester was challenging a Catholic debater on Wycliffe, the persecution of Wycliffe because he translated the Bible. And the Catholic said, well, we didn't persecute him because he translated the Bible. There's nothing wrong with that intrinsically. It's because he put so many heresies in it. Things like, the word presbyteros means senior instead of priest. Stuff like they call that heresy. And Brother David asked him, yeah, but what do you think now? Was the Catholic Church justified in killing the man and strangling him and torturing him? And he said, well, sure, he was a heretic. He deserved it.
Yeah.
And David's only reaction was just a funny face he made to the audience, but that's all he could say. What more you can say?
And this is another tactic in opposition to the reformers is to wipe them out, you know. A lot were killed. A lot in the name of religion, you know, lost their lives because they dared speak out and took position against the church. It also came into the New World and the South American areas, Peru and other areas. It was kind of dangerous in some places to not believe or not, at least not profess Catholicism. And this is one thing, they still have a lot of control in some of these third world countries. I don't know that there's any burning at the stakes anymore, but they do have a lot of control over the people. And a lot of it has to do with the ignorance of the people as well. Purgatory was asserted, and prayers for the deceased still required. Basically, purgatory is described as those who die in God's grace, but still imperfectly purified, are indeed assured of their eternal salvation. But after death, they undergo purification as to achieve the holiness necessary to enter the joy of heaven. Some of this doctrine is based on a text from 2 Maccabees, but their basic text comes from 1 Corinthians 3, verse 11 through 15. Paul said, "For other foundation can no man lay than that is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now if any man build upon this foundation gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, stubble, every man's work shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it, because of what sort it is. If any man's work abide, which he hath built thereon, he shall receive a reward. If any man's work shall be burned, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet so as by fire." This is the idea. But this is not talking about purification of the individual, but the purification of his works, you might say, more than that. But this is you cannot draw any conclusion on any verses that contradict the rest of the Bible. The idea of purgatory is certainly not supported.
If I understand these verses, Paul is writing as a missionary about what happens to missionaries. Missionaries put all their heart and soul into a work, and some of those works last, and the people they've worked with all those years are saved, and it's wonderful. But there are other times when you put everything into it, and yet you lose those people. They drift away, the cause is lost, and he's saying that the work shall be burned, but the man himself has not suffered loss. He's saved, and so is by fire. He's had to see the fire of his work destroyed. His life's work, in other words.
Yeah. And that purification had already taken place anyway. That goes back a little bit to what we talked about Wednesday night from the book of Ezekiel. That if a man is, say, a lost man, and you teach him, and he obeys the gospel, you might say, then of course we all rejoice and we're all saved. But if you teach him and he rejects it, you've still done your job. Even though he's lost, you won't be. But if you don't teach him, your blood will be held. I will require it of you. In other words, I hold you responsible for that. And I see that as parallel to that. But of course, we do believe in an after death intermediate habitation that we call Hades. And sometimes people will know what the difference is. Very quickly, we'll just call attention to the one verse we have, or the one incident we have concerning the doctrine of Hades we get from Luke 16 and the story of the rich man and Lazarus. And of course, we know the story. And the rich man died and was buried, and Lazarus died and was carried by angels to Abraham's bosom, which was synonymous with paradise. And then in torments, the King James Version says in hell. And growing up, I thought hell and Hades the same thing, So if you didn't really want to say hell, you'd say Hades and thought you was getting by with something, But they're not the same. And Hades refers to both paradise and torments, the eternal abode of the dead. But you remember the story when he said, I'm in torments, this flame, send Lazarus to, well, first of all, send him to dip his finger in the water and cool my tongue. He said, he can't do that. And here's why. There's a great gulf, you don't cross it. So to me, this alone would teach contrary to the idea of purgatory. That would be my primary answer to that doctrine.
I don't know. It's something I always kind of think of. I see Lazarus as kind of a passive individual in that story because, he doesn't interact at all, when Jesus is recounting this. And it makes me kind of wonder, can the people there, in the bad place, can they, they obviously know that these other people are there in Abraham's bosom, but do the people that are in Abraham's bosom, are they aware of the people that are suffering on the other side? Yeah, and so that's the question is, he was appealing to Abraham, not to Lazarus. So are they just completely oblivious? Because I couldn't imagine that heaven or even that, waiting place would be, how can it be pleasant at all if you could just constantly hear the wailing and the gnashing of teeth from...
And of course, Abraham could have said, well, don't worry about it. Lazarus is going to pay penance for you, and this thing won't last long. You'll be purified, and you'll get out, And then he says, well, then send him back to warn my brothers, So, we know that story. And, of course, there are some who say that was Old Testament doctrine. There's some that claim that paradise is now in heaven and that there is no what we call Hades. But I still believe that we have sufficient evidence to teach that there is an intermediate place of the dead.
Have you happened to come across what their views are on certain sins, how many years? Are they talking about a few hundred, a few thousand, or millions of years purification before you get out? What do they typically think about? Does it depend on what sin you committed, I guess?
Yeah.
They got to purge out of you?
But, how does time pass?
And how?
Very slowly.
You see what I'm saying? What does that even mean to say that there is, periods of time? That's an earthly thing. That's after there is no time.
And they say if you die in God's grace, well, if you die in God's grace, you're covered by His blood. That's one of the reasons to become a Christian anyway. And there's just no doctrinal evidence that Christians will be in torment for a while.
Another question I think that Jane was talking to me about, this was last week, a couple weeks ago. How much money do you think that you need to pay? Is it, how much per hour, getting out of purgatory? Do you
I don't know.
Like the what were they? The indulgences, or what was it? You were saying that there are people when they come to a funeral, they have a pot that you can put.
They have a box they're supposed to put their money in.
And does that buy them time?
I really don't know what the purpose of that money was. Memorials, but I really don't know. We didn't have the box out because we know you're supposed to, and some of the family got upset with us.
They went and got the box.
They went and got it and put it out, but it's all interesting. Let's try to finish this. The worship of saints. They deny they worship saints, but they say they just honor them. But when you start looking at how they treat them. And plus saints, there again, we're all saints. Sainthood is not something you attain by some great work you do or the great life you live. If you're a Christian, you're a saint. So that's different. But anyway,
Hey, Leroy. Hey,
If it's somebody you pray to, they're supposed to be higher than the normal people, right?
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
They pray to saints and.
And you know, I've said before, the word Christian appears 3 times, and the word saint, I guess, is 100 times. But we use the word Christian. You know, St. Philip's going to preach to us after a while. But you know, I think there's reasons why we don't. I mean, we really don't introduce ourselves as I'm Christian Philip. You know, I mean, that's a relationship you have with Christ. Sainthood is a relationship all Christians have. They're sanctified. They're set apart. The very fact that you are a child of God means you're sanctified, and that makes you a saint. And when Paul wrote his letters, he would refer to all the saints. The Counter-Reformation really wasn't much of a reformation of Catholicism. There wasn't hardly anything changed during this time. It was a counter to the Reformation, not a counter-reformation, you might say, primarily aimed at refuting and silencing the Protestant disagreements. Much of the Counter-Reformation was driven by politics. In Spain, for example, kings and queens were more than happy to apply Catholic resources towards stamping out dissenters, in their case, mostly Protestants. And one king queen that we know about, Ferdinand and Isabella, you know, the one that financed Columbus's, what would you call what he did? Anyway, his voyage, tried to discover that the world was round, not flat, and so forth. They were involved in some of this. Another interesting thing about them is their daughter was Catherine of Aragon, who was King Henry VIII's first wife. It was.
I'm going to tell this little story. I thought it was comical. I went to visit my uncle in Indianapolis, Indiana, and my aunt, and this little girl came over, and I don't know how the conversation got started. She said, well, she ate a hot dog for lunch. It was on a Friday. And they said, well, you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to eat fish on Friday. She said, oh, I'll just get forgiveness.
I'll just say the rosary.
Yeah.
I had a friend that was Catholic who was later converted, and he and I worked together. We had a little architectural business on the side when I was a draftsman at the Arsenal in Huntsville. And so Jane brought us hot dogs over one Friday evening. We stayed after work, was working on some plans. And we ate. When we got through, I said, Ed, you know this is Friday. You ate that hot dog. He said, well, it's okay if you forget. But he later moved to St. Louis. His wife was a member of the church then, and he and I talked a lot. And he moved to St. Louis and obeyed the gospel. And he later taught a course on church history. He moved back to Arab, Alabama, where his home. And but I never got to see him after that. And I don't know for sure if he's still living or not. Of course, the tools they used was deportation, excommunication, execution. That's how they got rid of him. Well, to close this out, the Council of Trent was kind of doubling down and entrenching Catholic theology. They defended transubstantiation, upheld the necessity of sacraments for salvation, rejected sola fide, that is, the scriptures only. They claimed tradition was as equal authoritative as the Bible. They still do. In addition, the Latin Vulgate was the one and only acceptable Bible for church use. And this was going out against those translations, which again, that debate you mentioned, this shows their attitude at that time to Wycliffe's translation. Then, since its politics was instituted by God, all political leaders are subject to papal authority. It addressed some complaints. The sale of indulgences was stopped. The roles of priests were more carefully defined. The use of sacred artifacts, relics, were greatly reduced. Certain aspects of music and liturgy and other practical issues were discussed as well, but we don't know what came of it. Council of Trent in III, an attempt to change those aspects of Catholicism that Protestants were justified in complaining about. The council came far too late. The Reformation had been in full swing for nearly a quarter century. So this is their answer to those reformers, which wasn't much of an answer. In other words, we believe what we believe, we're going to keep on believing it. Basically is what they were saying. Well, our next section we're going to introduce is what we call the Radical Reformation. That's kind of interesting. Thank you.